and then we'll get started, I guess.
Yeah, I'll keep omitting people as they come.
Okay.
Shall we get started then, Lloyd?
Yeah. Jess, did you need to do a bit of an intro, or should we just...
Yeah, I can do.
Yeah.
Are you going to be taking questions during the
yeah. So we'll if people have got questions, feel free to stick them in the chat, and then we can probably have a look at them later on.
Perfect. Okay. So whilst I'm just omitting people, hello, welcome to this lovely session, Pipe Dream or Possibility, making the move to online student training, which is very exciting and very relevant for what we're doing now. If you want to start introducing yourselves in the chat as to who we have here, and so we can know where you're from, what positions you are, that'd be great. I will be muting myself, but I'll take a look at the questions in the chat throughout the session. And if this session overruns, which it may do due to the fact that we started a bit late due to technical difficulties, we'll be moving this chat onto a Google Hangout at the end, which will be about 10 to. I will put the link in the chat at the end of the session so everyone knows where they're going to, but it is table, I was about to say it's table 1, but I'm not sure if it's table 1 or table 2. I might be getting confused, but I will definitely be putting it in the chat at the end of the session. But I will pass you on to now Lloyd and Emma, who have thankfully given up their time to teach us all about online training. So yeah, over to you guys.
Okay, so welcome everyone to Pipe Dream or Possibility, making the move to online student training. This session, as Jessica's already mentioned, is part of the Student Opportunities Festival running throughout this week and the next. I hope you find this session informative and are looking to sign up to other workshops, panels and talks that are being delivered. So who are we? I'm Emma. Start things off. I'm Emma Bramwell and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the Activities Development Coordinator at Leicester Students' Union. My role primarily centralises around student group governance and affiliation alongside delivering our annual committee training programme in collaboration with the Support and Development Department. Another key aspect of my role is managing our Students' Union reception and our team of 12 student staff who provide administrative support to the activities and volunteering team throughout the academic year. I've been working in students' unions now for nearly 3 years. My anniversary is in sometime next week, which is really exciting or worrying, I'm not sure. But before then, I was a student at the University of Leicester where I was secretary of our Quidditch club. And no, we don't fly.
I'm Lloyd, pronouns are he, him. I work in our support and development department at Leicester SU. So I look after the university's peer mentoring scheme, and I also consult with our other student-facing departments of the SU on the creation of training for students, including, as Emma said, working with her on the student group committee training. Before that, I've worked with student groups at Warwick and Nottingham Students' Unions, and like Emma, I myself studied at Leicester as well, where I was the social sec of the mixed hockey club about 1,000 years ago. So yeah, now we've introduced ourselves. I see you're all introducing yourselves in there as well. Looks like loads of new names and faces, which is very exciting.
Very exciting. As you can see, most of us don't seem to leave Leicester. We like it too much. So before we get going, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping announcements. First of all, this session is planned to last 50 minutes with time for question and answer at the end. After the session, you're more than welcome to head to the coffee shop area to discuss anything. Me and Lloyd will probably head along, or at least I will. Lloyd has another training session afterwards, and I'll be there to answer any questions. Secondly, there will be moments for discussion and feedback throughout the session. In this time, feel free to respond verbally by unmuting yourselves or in the chat or not at all. It's up to you. However, please be aware that this session is also being recorded and available to view again after we're finished.
So, in this session, we are going to look at why we decided to move our student group committee training online. We'll talk about that from both a training perspective and a student activities perspective. We're going to talk about our journey through that process of making that move, in a sense, giving you our recipe, which you'll likely want to adapt to the tastes and requirements of your own students. We'll also talk about some things that you may want to think about in the form of lessons we've learned along the way. As I mentioned, there'll be 10 minutes or so at the end for questions, but please feel free to post it in the chat if you want to ask a question as we go along. I will try and come back to those if we can. In this presentation or slash session, we're going to mainly talk about our student group committee training, but on the back of relative success with our student groups, this is also something that we're rolling out to our course reps and our student council. So we really do feel that it's relevant for the training of students in any leadership position. What we're not necessarily talking about in this session is delivering your existing sessions remotely in response to a global pandemic, for example. So when we talk about online training, we're referring to sort of self-paced click-through training like you might see in online CPD courses. When we say live sessions, that would also include those remote versions of live sessions framed as webinars, for example. So why train students online? It's probably fair to say that you wouldn't be tuning in if you didn't already think that online training was at least worth considering. So instead of trying to convince you all, we'll pull together a bit of a business case that could be used to present the idea to colleagues, students or officers in your own settings. I'm going to approach this from more of a general training perspective, and then Emma's going to drill down into it from more of a student activities specific angle. So I'm going to embrace my inner trainer with the closest thing that we can get to a flip chart exercise using Zoom. So we've displayed a question on the screen there. I'm going to ask you all now, please, to answer in the comments with suggestions of the sort of things you need to train student leaders in. This could be the things that your student group committee members need to know, or any other student leaders. So please feel free to go nuts in the comments, in the chat, just suggesting what sort of things you will train them in. Compliance with processes, absolutely. Let's drill down into which processes.
Finances, always a big one.
Yeah. Loads of stuff coming on here, brilliant.
Oh, the chat is flying by.
I think we'll be taking a lot of this for inspiration, actually, because there's really good stuff on here that actually we've not looked at.
Meeting next week, Lloyd?
Yeah, absolutely. How to book a room, absolutely.
External speakers, absolutely crucial.
Big one everywhere, that one.
Data protection. Anti-racism training.
Yeah, definitely really one that's come up recently. Okay, so we've got a real good mix there. Please feel free to finish off the ones that you're typing, and they'll appear as we carry on. So we've put together a few suggestions on our next slide, and we've broken a lot of these sorts of things down into two lists. The first one is on one side, we've got knowledge or understanding-based learning. So that's your stuff like how to fill out finance forms, where to collect your parcels, how to hire out your equipment, and a lot of the things suggested in the chat as well, like your external speaker requests and how to book a room and all that kind of thing would fall under this more knowledge-based content. And then others like the anti-racism training that I just saw in there, how to chair a meeting, that might be geared more towards what we would call the skills or experience-based learning. Now, I think what we found there when these were clicking through on the chat was the vast majority of the things that we're going to teach them are more geared towards that knowledge end of the scale rather than skills. And a mistake we often make is hauling in as many students as possible and delivering an hour or two of information or knowledge that they might feel they could have read through in their own time. I'm sure we've all heard or made the comment after a meeting or training session that all of the information delivered could have been sent in an email without the need to bring everyone together at the same time. And this is the idea of our online training, to deliver all of that knowledge-based stuff in a format that students can go through without coming onto campus at a specific time. With that as well, we make it more accessible, both in a physical sense by removing the need to travel, and also because the modules are self-paced and students don't need to frantically take notes while listening to a presenter. Most platforms are also compatible with screen readers, and as we'll talk about later, can be accompanied by a printer-friendly plain text handbook as well. Emma is going to talk in a minute about the convenience of online training from a staff perspective, but the long and short from a training perspective is that it's more convenient for our learners. As we mentioned before, they can work through the content at a time that suits them. With some platforms, you can allow users to save their progress as well and come back later if they need to. The training can be completed anywhere that has internet access, anywhere in the world, and this allows us to spread the training time into the Easter and summer breaks so that students don't have to complete it alongside their end of term exams and deadlines.
So alongside the objectives the support and development department had set out, the activities and volunteering team also had our own key goals. First of all, our training needed to be redeployed in a number of different contexts. For example, yes, our training is used primarily by committee members as part of their annual affiliation criteria, but it's also used to introduce incoming sabbatical officers to the department to give them an overview of what we offer. Additionally, it's used to welcome our student staff team into their roles following a successful interview. This prepares them for additional face-to-face or live sessions as we move forwards, offered closer to term time. The training can also be redeployed throughout the academic year, accompanied with handbooks. Committee members can be referred back to the training if they need to seek out key information. We also needed our training to be a time saver. This factor came in two main strands. Firstly, we wanted to ensure that we could deliver a high standard of training to over 1,000 students that would not have to be a lecture repeated 3 or 4 times over the course of semester 3. Secondly, we wanted it to be comprehensive and something that students would learn effectively from. By removing staff time dedicated to answering base level questions regarding things covered in the training, we found that it really frees up that space and that valuable resource for more meaningful interactions which can enhance and develop a student group. We also wanted our training to increase engagement with the content. When we were still running only live training sessions, we engaged around 30 to 40% of our core committee members, which at the time was president, treasurer, and secretary, for their compulsory training. This is a lot lower than what we were aiming for, especially as it covered key information on documentation and health and safety. By making the move to online student training, we found this number has increased rapidly, but more on that later. Okay, so we now have the why, but we're going to move on to how do you make the move to online student training, which I'm sure most of you are here for.
So yeah, a lot of people are asking the sort of question, well, how do you get started? And as a first step, I would always recommend sitting down with your team and making a list or mind map of everything students need to know or be able to do. This could take a while because there's going to be so many things, like we've just identified in that chat, hundreds of things, and the list will go on longer than that, but it's worth just making sure you've got everything covered. I think the mind map is probably the easiest way to do that, so you can bounce from one idea to the next. And then next is to split that list into those 2 columns as we did a moment ago. One side for knowledge, the other side for skills. Those skills things will most likely still require live sessions that can give students an opportunity to discuss and practice those more in-depth skills. I just won $500. More likely for us in Leicester, those will be webinar style sessions this year, given the unfortunate situation that I'm sure you all know we've found ourselves in as a city with our additional lockdowns. And then that knowledge list will form the basis of objectives for your self-paced online training. Next is to divide the content into modules, if that's what you want to do. We opt to break ours down into 5 modules as our delivery platform doesn't allow students to save their progress and come back a bit later. There's no right or wrong way to do this, and you don't necessarily have to break it down if your students would prefer one big module to work through. And since we require all of our committee members to complete all of our training, we break, all of our compulsory modules at least, we break ours down by topic rather than committee role, but there's nothing to say you couldn't do it the other way around. This is shown on the next slide, and this here is by no means a definitive list of modules for students' unions everywhere. And we really are showing this more as an illustration. I certainly wouldn't want anyone to use our 5 module titles as a starting point for their own training, and I'll talk about why in a second. So once we have the content we need to cover, we write a handbook for each module that tells students everything they need to know, providing them with all the knowledge from our knowledge list. A lot of students' unions might already create handbooks for your student leaders, which is great, and you might be able to use these and pull some text from them, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend using the entire existing handbooks as the basis for your training, because I'm sure we can relate to the fact that over the years, these handbooks can end up being absolutely filled with complicated and sometimes unnecessary detail. So I would really encourage you to take this opportunity to start from a relatively clean slate if you can. Emma's going to talk a little bit later on about how she makes sure that this content is clear and easy to understand, as it's Emma that writes the handbooks. But a big tip is to avoid unfamiliar jargon and acronyms. Anyone who's been in a meeting with senior university colleagues will be more than familiar with that feeling like you're sitting under this avalanche of acronyms to the point where entire sentences start to lose their meaning. Our handbooks are published on the committee area of the SU website, so that our members can access them for reference throughout the year. It's worth pointing out to students that these are live documents, so any changes to procedures during their time will be updated, and the web version always includes the latest information. One thing we did this year was ask our marketing team to spice up the handbooks with a bit of branding. So this slide basically just shows off the fabulous job they've done with the covers. As you can see there, we've got 8 separate documents this year, but there's nothing to say you couldn't put it all at once, all in one big, ideally searchable document if you are to do it all in one go. Once you've got the text in the form of handbooks, it's time to put that content into an engaging online format. So the handbooks will provide the bulk of the text for this online delivery, although there may be some elements at this point that students could get by without. It's always worth pointing out in the training, though, if at any point there is more information available in the handbooks, in case students do want to seek out that extra information. The aim of the game at this point is to present the information in a way that engages students to keep their attention, to break down the complicated information into manageable chunks, especially where you have longer or more complex processes, and hopefully to maximize the amount of information that they retain compared to just reading through the handbooks themselves. Many online platforms are sort of slide-based or page-based, ours included. So the key consideration here is not to have so many slides that they feel as if they're clicking through them forever, but also to avoid filling slides with so much content that they may as well just be reading through the plain text handbooks anyway. So for balance, I'd really recommend that you just keep asking yourself, would I want to read this? There are a couple of very tempting pitfalls when you start making online training. And the first one, as I mentioned before, is starting from the top with some module headings that you like, and then adding information underneath each of these headings afterwards. This can lead us to include some of that more potentially unnecessary detail, simply because it seems relevant to the headings, but might not necessarily be something that students need to know. But more crucially, it can cause us to miss out vital information that might not actually fit neatly within those predefined headings. So when creating any training, whether online or not, I can't stress enough that it's always best to start with the learning outcomes that you want students to achieve first, and then to break it down into areas with relevant headings afterwards. Next, when we start to feel the benefits of putting training online, we can start to wonder why we ever delivered live training. I've definitely been over that hill and hopefully now come out the other side of it. But by moving training online, we're not looking to remove those opportunities to interact with our students, like Emma just said. We are looking to make space to have more meaningful interactions with them, such as those live skills training sessions or development meetings. If you scrap the idea of live training altogether, then you lose that key opportunity to engage students in the more skill-based learning that we talked about before. And also, as we mentioned before, live sessions don't necessarily mean inviting people into a room together, particularly in a time when we're facing a global pandemic. So webinars can often provide similar functionality for discussion and practice of many of those more skill-based areas. And on a similar note, don't be tempted to try teaching complex skills through an online click-through module. It's incredibly hard to learn skills such as public speaking, for example, by reading about them. Online modules don't allow students to sort of practice those skills through trial and error and get feedback from facilitators or peer-to-peer discussion. So as a rule, I would always say if the learning objective requires practicing a skill, it's always worth a live session.
Okay, just to reiterate, if you could please mute your microphones for the moment, that'd be greatly appreciated. Okay, so after making your content, it's time to start looking for a platform. It's important to remember the needs of every student cohort at every students' union is different. So I want to open this question to the floor and ask, what are you all looking for in a platform to deliver your training on? If you could put it in the chat, that'd be greatly appreciated, and we'll go through it in a minute. Easy to use.
Great start.
Stats and data. We love a bit of stats at Leicester.
Oh, we do. And a spreadsheet. Everyone loves a
Mhm.
spreadsheet in the student union.
Accessible
Testing
format.
understanding.
Absolutely.
Testing understanding we'll talk about in a minute as well.
Professional looking. Quizzes.
Yes, absolutely, the quiz. Tracking we'll talk about as well, won't we?
Yes. Some my students are familiar with. Something engaging. Some really good points here. Not loads of effort back end qualifying things. Integrated into a platform we already use, says Izzy. Easy to access.
Ooh.
LinkedIn. Ooh,
I like
that's
that.
a new consideration.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll probably move on, but as before, please keep putting your ideas in. They're super helpful for us and for everyone else that's attending the session today.
Tomorrow.
So I feel like many of our considerations definitely line up, which is promising, as this is what we started with at Leicester SU, amongst other things. So the first thing that we thought about was cost. At our SU, we do not have an in-house web developer, so outsourcing was our next best option. However, we wanted to ensure that we were making minimal capital investment to ensure the longevity of the platform despite any possible budget changes. We also wanted the platform to be accessible to every student leader and looked at the integration of screen readers and image descriptions alongside the development of plain text alternatives that could be offered. The platform also needed to be adaptable, ensuring that we can continue to deliver effective training at all points. For us, this worked in two different ways. Firstly, as with many activities departments or other departments and students' unions generally, our processes and offer can change over the course of an academic year, and our modules needed to reflect this. For example, in August, we're planning to launch our online student finances, which I've been waiting such a long time for, and it's very exciting. But at this point, we're going to go back into our modules and remove the old offline finances guidance so it's fully streamlined, ready for new student groups who utilize it later in the year. I'm sure also that we all know the feeling when you've read for a project a million times and you can no longer see the mistakes. Despite playtesting the modules with student staff and my fellow colleagues, we had an issue recently arise where a question was not forthcoming with an answer. The platform we use allowed us to quickly dive in and change the module without disrupting the experience for our student leaders and cursing the fact that we missed it in the first place. Finally, we wanted to ensure that our training was usable, as there's no point in a pretty training if every other aspect of it isn't effective. This came in the form of ensuring that it was usable across mobile and tablet alongside desktops for all of our students. Also, we made sure that all our text was easy to read and the information displayed in a palatable fashion that was not overwhelming. One thing we wanted to ensure was that we could easily deliver the training should something go wrong on the website for whatever reason. We don't have control of our platform and we never will, so we really needed to make sure this was key. By having our handbooks and the information being mirrored across the two platforms, it allows us to have all the content we need in case we need to migrate to a different platform at any point. Of course, I cannot reiterate enough the importance of research when finding your platform. In downtimes, like over the Christmas break, we spent some time looking through other students' unions' websites to see what worked for us. This is something I continually do each year when revisiting committee training to ensure that we're using the best platform. It's a nice little break, you know, from some admin to just have a look around. A notable mention that stood out to me is the London School of Economics platform, which I believe to be custom built, but correct me if I'm wrong if there's anyone here from LSE. It's super nice, super functional, and it just displays information in a really, Connor, you're here. It's an amazing training. I love it. For us, we decided to use Ophia. We found this to be an intuitive platform that's easy to work with and edit. For us, it's also really helpful from a GDPR perspective, as the site has no internal tracking. Of course, I realize a lot of you have mentioned you want internal tracking, but we got around that, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. Although it doesn't have a great amount of customization, that's absolutely fine. We've still found it workable for inserting our own graphics and headers, and it's just nice. It's a nice platform. Oh, and the platform is Ophia. Ellen has written it in for us. So over to Lloyd.
So this slide just very briefly gives a rough idea of our development cycle for the training. So anyone who's made training before will be well aware of the brief idea of these steps involved. The thing I just want to point out is that we are revisiting the project throughout the year, making the process a lot more manageable than if we were to tackle it in the few weeks before committee handover. So if it is something you're thinking about doing for the first time next year, then I would fully recommend sort of getting started, really early on, so you can have that sort of identifying needs time during the autumn term, and then developing the materials early in term 2.
So this is the journey we went on at Leicester Students' Union, and let me tell you, it was a lot of trial and error to get our current formula. Please note this timeline works within our current committee time in office, which runs June to June every single year. And for our training cycle, just go back in the recording and pause it on Lloyd's slide. Between June 2016 and June 2018, our compulsory training hub was housed in Blackboard, which is our university's VLE, with an inbuilt quiz. The information for this quiz was delivered through Prezi, a dynamic presentation platform which can be found online and used for free. At this time, only the core roles of president / club captain, treasurer and secretary completed the training. Between June 2018 and June 2019, we made the move to Oppia, which allowed us to integrate content with a quiz at the end. Across 12 to 15 small modules rated compulsory, highly recommended to recommended, etc., we offered catered training to each committee member category. This meant that the training of a secretary looked very different to the team captain's training, the publicity training, the list goes on. There's around 9 to 12 categories that we put our committee members in. For that year, we did have a comparatively low completion rate for the training, hitting 50% in December instead of our intended date of June/July. At the end of this cycle of training, we also held a series of focus groups to get feedback from our committee members. These proved to be crucial in solidifying our own suggested changes, but also adding some new ones. In each of these 2 cycles, I want to stress that we were chasing throughout the academic year to get our students to complete it, which didn't look great on the department. Between June 2018 and June 2021, which is our current platform of training, we have continued to use Oppia to deliver less modules, but with a more advanced quiz at the end that Lloyd will touch on later. As a companion, each module has a plain text handbook, which is updated throughout, as and when needed, which sits along the MSL survey function to record the training and bring everyone back to our own website. The other noticeable change within this era has been the move to all 1,000 plus committee members receiving the exact same training modules, in the belief that at some point, every person will have to signpost, have to organise an event, or fill in an event form. For us, this has been a huge success. We hit 85% completion at the end of the 2019-2020 academic year. That was just our final figure. And this year, 15 minutes left on the Zoom call, thank you. And this year we reached 90% completion as of today, as it also happens to be our committee training deadline day, which has fitted in nicely. We're so pleased with this, considering the global situation, and are looking forwards to further upward projection ready for September. Of course, even with these figures, I want to emphasize there isn't such a thing as the perfect committee training or student leader training generally. Even now, Lloyd and I have been having conversations on how we could improve these modules to best support our students. 2 of these changes include the signposting of new content, which Lloyd will speak about later, and the integration for students, the integration of video for students that learn better through verbal instruction rather than written.
So in terms of structure of the modules themselves, the structure of a module is very much dependent on how you want them to feel to users. Generally, as I think some people have talked about earlier, actually, you want a blend of delivering the content and also checking understanding. I know someone mentioned that when they're talking about what they wanted from their platform. Our platform up here is broken into sort of slides or pages with the option to have an interaction at the end of each, such as a question or a text field to type in or rearranging items. Previous iterations of our training, we've interactions throughout each module to check understanding periodically, which can create quite an engaging interaction, particularly for new committee members. But feedback from those focus groups that I mentioned before suggested that it might disengage those returning members who already have a lot of knowledge about our processes. It slows down their progress through the module. So our current approach is to deliver all of the information in sequence before asking 5 questions on key learning points at the end of the module. If students get a question wrong, then the software redirects them to the relevant section of the module to find the answer, and then invites them to retry the question afterwards. So I think we've got, so this essentially allows students who already know a lot of the information to move through that module more quickly, but still checks their understanding of those most important points. As Emma mentioned, next year we're aiming to further support our returners by pointing out exactly which areas include new information. We're hoping that this will encourage them to read through these sections more carefully without the need to check their understanding throughout and potentially disengage them.
So after choosing your platform and you formulated your modules, it's important to consider what you want to be compulsory and non-compulsory. For us, deciding this came down to 3 main factors: whether they needed the knowledge to operate their student group or on a base level, whether they would seek out the information on their own, and of course, the goals of the department and the manifestos of our executive officers. Let's touch on those topics a bit further. First of all, think about whether they actually need to know the information to run their group. For us, this was things like reimbursing members, improving inclusion, and safely running events. It's not necessary for them to know how to use the union website, but it's nice to have. Also, would they seek out that information on their own if it was a live session? It can be really difficult to encourage students to come along to a face-to-face session, as I mentioned earlier on, especially when they're juggling running their student groups, their academic life, their social life. There's a lot going on, and it's really hard to fit that in. And finally, consider the goals of your department. We wanted to ensure that our student groups were actively evaluating and improving their inclusivity this year. And as such, due to the importance and amount of content that we wanted to cover, this became its very own module. You could also consider the goals as a point of integration instead of a standalone thing. Another key goal for us this year was to help our committee members articulate their skills when applying for further study or jobs. It was something that sat across all of our modules, and as such, every single one now ends with a skills summary section in line with our careers development services framework. So if I click along, this is our current structure here at Leicester SU. You would have seen these icons a little bit earlier on. We have 5 compulsory modules, which are inclusion for student groups, student group financial management, running your student group events, your time on committee, and wellbeing for student groups. And we also have our non-compulsory modules of marketing your student group, understanding the union website, and student group handover and affiliation. We chose our non-compulsory modules for a range of reasons. For example, understanding the union website was born out of a necessity to familiarise our committee members with MSL after we moved to the platform in the summer of 2018. At this point, many of them were very skeptical about how it worked and what it would do for them. So we felt it was best to bring them on that journey and to walk them through that admin panel. I sometimes think I went a bit heavy on the hype because a lot of my committee members came back and went, "Who wrote this? Are you working for them?" It's very odd. But it worked. With handover and affiliation, we had a lot of feedback from our groups that they'd never received handover from their outgoing committees and found it really difficult to fill in our free core affiliation documents. You may think that it's really surprising that this one is not compulsory, as it deals with areas such as a master risk assessment and the Constitution. But this is due to the fact that the documents themselves already contain guides on how to complete them. And this is supplementary material in case you've never ever come across a risk assessment before, or you have nowhere to start with filling in a constitution. So we're now going to look at some additional considerations you may want to make when writing and delivering your own online student training with regards to feedback, tracking, cheating, and understanding.
Okay, so with regards to feedback, I will quickly just briefly gloss over this so we've got more time to talk about the other bits, but anyone who's been involved in training will know that evaluation is a key part of the cycle. The off-peer platform does allow a mechanism for students to report bugs, but they don't tend to use that very much in favour of just emailing us if they have a problem with it. What we tend to do is we send out a more holistic feedback form through an evaluation survey on MSL. This is circulated to all the students who've completed modules as part of the tracking process, which Emma will briefly mention now.
Okay, so for me, effective tracking was an absolute must, as I'm sure with a lot of you. I wanted to make sure that once I'd launched our training, it was a side project for me, rather than dominating my workload, but I'm sure like many of you, a number of other projects needed my attention at the time. As Lloyd mentioned, after the completion of the training on OPIA, all students are directed to MSL, the MSL survey function, where they give us their unique student ID. From here, we import the data into an Excel spreadsheet, which works out which modules they've completed and which modules they have left. It takes around 10 minutes in the morning. It's nice and simple. I can do it with my morning cup of coffee. From here, we can then mail merge with ease to inform students that they have completed their training or which modules they have left. This is accompanied on the spreadsheet with a statistics page that gives us an overview of how individual student groups are performing alongside the cohort as a whole, and also individual committee role categories. This has proved really useful for us when presenting figures to our board of trustees or talking to colleagues, or when pulling out our current completion rate for presenting to you guys. I'm not going to lie, when I first started working on our Excel tracking sheet, it felt like an endless task. I'd be more than happy to go for our tracking systems at a later point in time. I have some examples I can give people if they'd like me to talk through it. As a result, I'd encourage you to think about these questions to shape how you run your tracking system. First of all, does it need to be committee specific? Does it need to be role specific, or does everyone complete the same modules? What are your department skills? Do you have the ability to go on Excel courses run by the university like ours offer? And what use is it to you and your students? Can you use it as a method of giving them feedback and encouragement? Because you don't want to build something that's just going to sit there all year and be absolutely useless to you.
Okay, so cheating. Tracking, as Emma says, takes place via a completion survey at the end of each module. One of the imperfections of our model is that students could, if they chose, copy that link and share it with other people. Essentially, no matter how you track completion of online training, students will find a way to cheat, whether that be skipping all or part of it or sharing answers to the questions. So that's not to say it's a bad idea to move training online. I would equate clicking through without reading it carefully to a student attending a live presentation, signing the register, and sitting through it without paying attention. Some students will always do either, but as Emma mentioned a moment ago, we've seen a sharp increase in our engagement figures by going online from less than 40 to now 90%. So we're confident that we have more students making good use of the training than was the case 6 years ago when I attended events and safety training as a committee member myself. So with more students attending the training or completing the training, we have a greater degree of accountability from our committees. So by filling out the committee survey, they state that they've completed and understood the training. And later, when they then come in excited to report that they've donated a large sum of money to charity without banking it properly, we can point out that the correct procedures were outlined in the training and they had confirmed their understanding of this. Now, this doesn't undo that mistake, but I would hope that they could then encourage their successors to avoid the same sort of embarrassment by reading the training information carefully. And this is a gradual culture change that doesn't come without a degree of trust. Committee training is the first experience many students have of the SU outside of a nightclub setting, for example. And if we want students to see us as a supportive friend rather than a nagging parent, we need to make that first move towards trust. Having worked with student groups at a few students' unions now, my anecdotal experience is that the more tightly we control the activities of our groups, the more they see us as a bureaucratic hindrance rather than a support structure. They then attempt to get around us, we then add a new form or process, and so on. And this eventually leads to them being secretive in their activities to the point that we can't help them make the right choices because we have no idea what they're actually doing. So as it says on there, the more we hold their hands, the more we have to hold their hands. So we think people are taking more out of the training online than they would otherwise, but there is a degree of trust that has to go into that.
And finally, understanding. It's crucial that your training makes sense and is useful to your student leaders, as otherwise you're creating a resource they're not going to effectively engage in. From experience, I'd recommend the following. First of all, look at how you can produce supplementary material to assist in people's understanding of the modules. At Leicester, this came in the form of providing examples, diagrams, pictures, and additional resources when needed, including a budget spreadsheet and project plan example. As we mentioned earlier on, this will also include videos in the future. When starting to write your modules, you also need to look at how you're explaining the steps of the information you're talking about. For example, if you're asking a student to fill in a form, think about explaining why you need to fill in the form before moving on to how. And if you can't figure out how to explain the process clearly and concisely, maybe it's time to start a process review. Don't be afraid of doing that. We want to become more and more the support structures and not the red tape they don't need. As we mentioned throughout the training, the importance of face-to-face sessions or live sessions, depending, cannot be underestimated, and for some skills, they cannot be delivered on an online platform, and that's okay. At Leicester, key areas of learning that are not delivered online are in 2 other ways. With face-to-face interactions, we host workshops in our student group assemblies, which take place semesterly. They're otherwise known as like president's meetings, society meets, whole range of different things, and see at least 1 committee member from each group attend. In these, we host a workshop and discussion segment to allow the groups to develop key skills such as running safe and inclusive nights out and employability as a committee member. The last thing I'd say is really, please don't work in isolation. Talk to your colleagues, any student, staff, or your executive officer team to see what they think. And know that they're there to support you. They're not there to hinder you. So I'm going to probably skip over this, Lloyd, just because we only have a few minutes. So we're going to move over to Google Hangouts for the question and answer, but in case you're not going to come along to that, I've quickly wanted to put mine and Lloyd's emails up on the screen and to say a massive thank you so much for coming along to our session today. We hope that you found it informative. If you have any questions about anything we've discussed in today's session, please feel free to get in touch with either Lloyd or myself, or both of us if you want to. Our email addresses will also be hanging around in the Google Hangout for a little bit as well. And yeah, I guess we'll go over to the Google Hangouts.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to say thank you to Emma and Lloyd on behalf of everyone. That was so informative and just really interesting to listen to. I've just posted the link to the Hangout in the chat, but I will send it again. Not to you personally, Lloyd, everyone. There we go. I can understand Zoom at the same time. So if you want to join us over on there, Emma and Lloyd can answer any questions and just discuss online training even more if you would like to.
Our favourite topic. We could talk forever about it.
Best topic. But yeah, thank you very much for coming, and thank you again to you two for hosting this wonderful session.
Thanks, Jessica.
Right, see you guys over there in a minute.
Yes.
Okay, now let's